I don't know how big a deal the end of the school year is for all of you. In my household, the end of the school year is roughly tantamount to Christmas, Easter, and Pentecost all rolled up into one. And so as we approach the end of the current school year, and on this day that we have set aside to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the program that would come to be known here as Reading Buddies, and to celebrate the lifetime of commitment to that program of our own Pat Quigg, I thought it appropriate then to reflect this morning on the special place that education has had in our religious tradition. I think it is certainly fitting that alone among the religious movements that emerged from the Protestant Reformation, that ours is the one that is not identified by where it took place, as in the case of the Anglican Reformation, nor by whom it was led, as in the case of the Lutheran churches, but rather by what it did. That being to pursue the cause of reform more zealously than anywhere else, thus known to this day as the Reformed tradition. I think it is also important for us to note that this impulse toward reform was directed not only toward the church, but also the larger society, out of a very deeply held conviction that the whole world is the theater of God's glory, not just the church, and that civil society was certainly as susceptible to corruption as the church, corruption that was just as much a concern of God as corruption in the church. And from very early on in our experience, it became clear that the most effective instrument of reform, the best way to make this world a better place, was education. Education, whether in the church or civil society. And as a result, everywhere those schooled in the Reformed tradition ventured, schools followed in their wake. And nowhere was this more true than in our own country, where churches of the Reformed tradition, both Presbyterians and our cousins, the Congregationalists, were in the vanguard of establishing institutions of learning at every level. Establishing the first college on these shores in the year 1636, and later the first college west of the Alleghenies, the first college west of the Mississippi, the first college west of the Rockies, and for good measure, the first college in Alaska. Indeed, as late as the Civil War, nearly two-thirds of the institutions of higher learning in this nation were of either Presbyterian or Congregationalist origin. And they are schools that to this day remain integral to the life of the communities of which they are a part, in many ways more so even than the church itself. And what I'd like for us to think about today is why that's so. Why it is that education has proved so important. Why education has made such a great difference. Such a difference that it is, or should be, a significant concern of the church. Our scripture lessons this morning suggest two ways in which that is the case, beginning with Paul's famous claim that it is the God who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," who has shown in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. It is that image of light shining in the darkness An image so important to both Paul and John in their understanding of the gospel that is, I think, for us the goal of education. The goal of education at every level. Light shining in the darkness. In fact, education is and always has been the most effective tool for bringing the light of truth to bear on the darkness of both ignorance and superstition. Twin forces that have plagued human societies from the very beginning and have everywhere been, and in too many places still are, the greatest impediment standing in the way of human beings reaching their full God-given potential. The conviction that is literally written into the founding documents of the Presbyterian Church, and which, by the way, is printed on the cover of your bulletin today, a statement officially adopted by the First General Assembly of our church, meeting in this church on May the 21st, 1789. The conviction that truth is in order to goodness is a bold claim that the vigorous pursuit of the truth is the only truly secure foundation for a well-ordered, godly, and free society. Light shining in the darkness. And that is, I think, what education is all about. It is all about a vigorous pursuit of the truth, no matter where it leads, no matter how much it may challenge cherished traditions or long-held beliefs, no matter even how painful or embarrassing the truth may prove to be for us. A perfect example of which is found in our Old Testament lesson this morning in the case of Eli. For here in 1 Samuel, Eli learns from Samuel, a boy, of God's judgment against his house. And yet, despite the fact that it is a grim future that awaits him, Eli accepts that and submits to God's will because he knows it's the truth. And the more we know of the truth, we know of the truth in every realm, the better we know God. And the better we know God, the better we can serve God in our lives. Light shining in the darkness. These days, though, there's another reason why I think education is so important, a reason that is particularly relevant in our world today. And that is simply the fact that from time to time situations arise when it becomes clear that we need to rethink how and why it is we do things the way we do. Now, this is particularly true in times of rapid change, kind of times we live in today, times when things that used to work very well simply no longer do so. And yet too often we just keep doing them out of sheer habit, if nothing else, oblivious to the fact that they're not working anymore. Even worse, there are times when things that used to work very well begin, because of changes in the world around us, to have unintended consequences that not only render those actions ineffective, but can even undermine the very purpose why we were doing them in the first place. And we see a perfect example of that in our gospel lesson for this morning, where Jesus comes into conflict with the religious authorities of his day over the rules governing the Sabbath. Here Jesus challenges those rules, not because Jesus had no regard for the Sabbath, but because he understood that this was a case of their insisting on the letter of the law even when it effectively undermined the spirit of the law. Jesus proved willing to rethink the traditional ways precisely in order to preserve what was truly valuable about them, to preserve the spirit of the tradition rather than merely satisfied with preserving the letter. And in the exact same way, I think we all must be willing today to question the way we do things, to question the way we do things when what we've been doing simply no longer works. Or worse, is undermining the reasons why we did those things in the first place, or even worse than that, when the way we're doing things actually creates barriers that keep others from coming to an understanding of the gospel, something that happens these days far more often than we would like. And that spirit of questioning, that willingness to question everything, is the very essence of education, of light shining in the darkness. But if education is so important to the health and well-being of both church and society, what can we do about it? In the past, as I noted earlier, the church responded to the need for education by founding schools. But for all kinds of reasons, many of them economic, that's really not a feasible option for us today, particularly for the kind of schools that are most needed. There are a number of things, however, that we can do, and in some cases are already doing, and could do more. For one thing, we can continue to support programs like Reading Buddies, programs like Musicopia, which are providing needed services that in recent years have been eliminated from much of public education, largely for budgetary reasons. If you've ever been here at the church on a Monday morning during the school year when a class comes over from Greenfield Elementary for Reading Buddies, or on Tuesday afternoons when the church is swarming with kids here for Musicopia, then you know what's possible. And if you've never been here to see either of those things, I would urge you to come. Another thing that we can do is to continue to support efforts to provide campus ministry at the schools near us. Now, we do support the work of the Christian Association at the University of Pennsylvania, whose chaplain, of course, is our very own Megan Lecluse. But it'd be wonderful if we could do even more in the future, both at Penn and at other schools nearby. And I'm not sure that there's anything we could do that would be more important than that. I'm convinced that the worst mistake that the church made in the 1960s and 70s, a time when the church made a lot of mistakes, but the worst one was essentially just giving up on campus ministry. No one knew what to do at the time in the face of a rapidly changing landscape. So in all too many cases, we just threw up our hands and gave up, hoping against hope that all those young people would eventually find their way back on their own to the church. And guess what? They didn't. Which is why we have to rebuild our efforts on college campuses. And thank God for people like Megan, who have stayed at it with painfully little support from the larger church. Finally, I think we can continue to try to do something that's very important right here. And that is to provide a worshiping home for the students who are here in the many schools in our area. Hopefully providing for them a place where they can begin the task of integrating their education and professional training with their faith. A significant challenge at a time like the present, when so much of the world of higher education is largely indifferent, if not actively hostile, to matters of religious faith. And whether those students remain here when finished with their education or training, as so many of you have, or whether they move on, as so many of the young people who have come through this church over the last decades have, whichever it is, by providing a safe and welcoming place for them at a critical point in their lives to nurture their faith. Doing that may be one of the most important things we can do as a church, because doing that makes for a better world, and a better world is what we're all about.